Welcome to Lesson 8. In this lesson, we are going to develop an external service plugin. Now, external services are related to web services, and we will get to understand the difference between the two in the Moodle world. We're going to look at the Web Services API, we're going to look at the External Functions API, and then additionally, we're going to develop another plugin, data format plugin, another way of exchanging data in Moodle. Right, before we start, let's have a look at the web services versus external services. The Web Services API refers mainly to the API to support the development of web service protocols. So the core protocols, the ones that ship with Moodle, are REST, SOAP, XML, RPC. And if you wanted to develop something else, you could use the API to do so. And then there's two links here to assist you if you want to look further and deeper into the issue of web services. The External Services API is, on the other hand, allows plugins to expose external services through a web service. Now, external services can be used for other things, but the main reason would be to expose some functionality to a web service. And Moodle ships with a lot of external services because a lot of the core components expose external functions. And there's a link to the documentation to allow you to have a look at External Functions API. A word of note, uploads and downloads, it's a little bit more complicated when it comes to especially file uploads. When you are using external services, you can't use like the file API really in the way we've discussed previously. And so usually what would happen is the client would have to make two calls. One to the relevant endpoints, the ones we're just going to talk about now, and then the other to the functionality with external service passing the item ID for the file. Something very similar to what we did in a previous lesson with our audio feedback. Okay, so the endpoint for uploading files is /webservice/upload.php, and the files are saved in the token user's draft area, and the results are returned in JSON format. Positive results will return an array of file object details, including the item ID, and that's the important one, because when you go to the next call, you've passed the item ID, and then the file can be found and then moved into the file area. This is works very similar to what we did with the audio feedback plugin. Okay, and then the other way would be to call web service plugin file PHP, which works like the standard. This is to deliver the files. Okay. There are two other core Moodle functions specifically for just uploading and downloading files. Core files upload and core files get files, which are defined in the libdb services.php. So for more information about file support with web services and external services, there's a link here in the presentation. So in the presentation, I mentioned that there are a lot of external services that are already provided by many of the core Moodle components. So here on this page, and the link will be in the lesson, is a list of all the external services that are already developed and ready to use by web services in Moodle. As you can see, there's a lot to do with like calendars, authentication, cohorts, competencies, and a whole chunk of stuff that before you think of developing an external service of any kind, it's always a good idea to come and have a look and see whether the functionality is already available in the core. So let's have a look at how this is all administered in Moodle. Okay, I'm going to log in as admin, go to site administration, go to server, and at the bottom here we have web services. Now, because it's a long process, there's a lot of help in setting up. So there's quite a lot of work involved for the site administrator in terms of setting up or allowing access to the local Moodle for web services. So the first thing that needs to be done is you have to enable web services. So by default, web services are not enabled. So you'd have to enable web services. So there's two types of process here. Well, let me step back a little bit. There's a process where you got users as clients with token, and you got one which allow external system to control Moodle. So this is one where you generate a token, give it to the client, and they will make calls with that token. The second example is where users have to generate a token. They log in, they generate a token, and then they can use the external services. And they kind of overlap. So anyway, the longer process, let's go through that. So you enable the web service, right? And if you click on that, it takes you to the screen that allows you to enable and disable web services. You have to enable the protocols. So you decide which protocols you want to be available. I'm using the back because it's easier. You create a specific user, so a specific user for the web service. You make sure that that user has the right capabilities. Now, you may have mentioned when we were talking about roles and enrollments that I said it's normally only external services or web services that require a role to be defined. And this is what you'd find yourself having to do, to define a role to provide those capabilities to that particular user. Okay, and then you select the services that they will be able to use and the functions. So services and functions are connected. We'll see that as we develop our plugin. And then add the web service as an authorized user, create a token, and enable documentation. Testing the service is actually not really fully developed, because if you look at the functionality, if you remember our list that we looked through on the Moodle documentation, that's all that's actually available as part of the test client. So, and the slight difference is obviously with the users as a client, they would need to authenticate. They get a token, they then use that token to access the external services. So these are the steps that that the administrator has to go through creating, allowing for web services, external services. Now, some of it we can help the admin user by defining it in our code, but others they would have to manually actually carry out the administrative tasks related to it. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's go and develop our plugin. So we are going to develop a external services plugin that we will call Practical Grader. And the aim with this Practical Grader is to allow an external application to send student grades for practical activities. So for example, if they're doing a laboratory experiment that uses a different system to track progress, etc., or they're out on a practical exam out in the field and what have you, and you've got a system that they use, and that system then can write to Moodle and give us the grades that the student has got in that activity. So we're going to develop it as a local plugin. So we're going to go to our local directory. We'll create a new folder, and we're going to call it Practical Grader. And I'm going to do the language folders at the same time. So as usual, we'll start with our version PHP file. So there's the usual stuff as we always do, defining our version, defining the required version of Moodle, and our component name. So let's create our language file. Local underscore practical grader PHP. So this is our file with the required string defined, and we're calling our plugin practical activity grade importer. So with just these two files, local plugins, you can install. So let's do that. So I'll just log in as admin. And now, as I say, I've mentioned several times before, if we had database tables to manage and what have you, we could then use the XMLDB tool to actually start developing our tables. So that's it, it's installed. Let's go and look at what more we need to do to take this forward. So I'll log out. So back in our code, what we need to define our external services, and that is done in a file called services PHP in the DB folder. So we'll put our DB folder in there, and we'll create a new file, services.php. So I'll put the code in and we'll discuss what it's doing. So we have the usual stuff at the top, and then we define a functions array. The keys of that array are the functions that are being exposed by our web service, our external service. Okay, and I need to say external service. Sometimes I'll say web service instead when I mean external service. Right, and what does that do? So we've got a function there, which is our component name underscore save, and then that in the array we've got class name, and we're pointing to a class which we have not yet defined, or the file we haven't defined a class yet, but we will do. And this would normally be sort of expected to be auto-loaded. But if you don't do auto-loading class, you do have a way of using the class path, which will be the name of the file where the class has been defined. And if both class name or class path is not defined and it is not auto-loaded, then Moodle will look for a file called external lib php. Okay, and then you have the method name that's being called in that class when that function is called, and then you give it a description and the type of operation it is, read or write. So in this case it's write, and there are a couple of other items that you can define in your function array, and that's Ajax. So true or false depending on whether the web service is callable via Ajax. Capabilities, an array of capabilities required by the function, and services, which is optional since Moodle 3.1, an array of built-in services by short name. We'll discuss services in a short while. Now, optionally, in our services PHP, we can define another array, and I'm going to add the details in, and then we'll discuss it. So the other array is called services. Now this is optional, you don't need to define it, but if you don't define it, then the site administrator has to do something via the UI to actually do this bit of providing an external service. So in this array, again, we have a key, and that will be the service. We can have several services for our particular external service plugin, but we defined one which we're calling practical grader, and in that service we have the functions that make up part of that service. So as you can see, there's our local practical grader save, which is defined up there. So practical grader includes the array of these of functions. Okay, Restricted users is set to false. If enabled, the Moodle administrator must link some user to use the service. So if it is enabled, the admin would have to be choosing users to actually be able to use the service. Okay, the required capability. So we will have to define a capability, and this is the capability that the user would have to have, or the web server would have to have. That's on top of the web service use, etc. capabilities. We decide if it's enabled by default, and we have the short name. Now, a short name cannot be set in the UI at the moment. So if you need to use short names, which we will need to do, you then have to define a services array. There's no other way of doing it. And if you look back at our functions one, where it says the services, the functions can use, that would be by short name, and therefore you would have had to define your services array. Okay, and then there are two other ones that I haven't enabled. I've just put them in as a commentary. Download files, if the service will allow downloads of files or uploads of files. So that's the array there. The restricted users flag is interesting. Okay. It underlies the two ways in which access is managed to a service, an external service, right? When the flag is set, then each user, as I mentioned earlier, would require the right capabilities. So they would require additional capabilities such as create token, and then the web service use, and then the right capabilities to access the actual service itself. And the user will need to be added in the user interface. If it's not set, in theory, then all users can access the service as long as they have that web service use capability. But generally in practice, this is only used to allow an external service to use the functionality. So it involves creating a special user, assigning them to a new role that has the required capabilities, generating a one-off token, which we mentioned earlier on when we were looking at the web services, and then all that client needs to do is present the token to access the service. So it's a little bit confusing, but as you will see, we actually going to do a mix of those two things as we develop our plugin. So our users, we still kind of restricting our users because we want our user to be able to log in, identify them, issue them a token, and let them then grade the pupil. So the process for restricted users is usually the client will have to call login token.php, providing a username and password and the short name of the service, and that's why we require the short name. That allows Moodle to identify what service they are actually looking to use, and then we will get back a token. You're going to see this in action as we develop our plugin. Okay. The required capability array, I've tried to set it as an array, but it seems to create some kind of error. So that's something that I don't know if it's an issue that may affect you, but I'm just saying it as in passing. Okay, so we need to define a capability anyway. So let's go ahead and define a capability in our plugin. So the file we need is an access.db, access.php file. So in the DB folder, as we've done before. So this is our access PHP file. We're only defining one particular capability, local practical grader grade. We've given it a response of cross-site scripting. It's a write, and it is in the context of the system. It can't be in the context of the course because obviously the user needs to access the system as a user. So it wouldn't work in the context of a course. So this is what we've got here now. As usual, we need to define a string for our for our capability. And here we go, we've got our capability and a description for that capability. So let's upgrade our version and then go back and upgrade our plugin. So back in Moodle, upgrade our plugin. Now what we need to do in practice, we need to create a new role with the required capabilities, and then we assign users to them. So this can be really a bit of an administrative burden, but for example, we can't assign the rights to teachers because teachers' roles are defined at course level, and web service capabilities need to be defined at system context level. So we kind of stuck with having to create a new role. Okay, so we're going to create a new role called practical grader for our users. So we'll go into site administration, users, and then we're going to go and define roles. Okay, and these are the roles that are already available. We add a new role. We're not going to base our role on any of the archetypes as we did in the previous, or on existing roles or on archetypes. We're going to ignore this whole thing here and start, and we're going to call our grader. I got that right. I don't think it makes much difference in terms of custom name, etc. So we're going to define it at the system. We're not using that role archetype. We're going to define that at the system. We're going to ignore everything here, okay, and we're going to decide on the capabilities. So what have we got to do? We want our practical grade allowed. Yeah, access to the practical grading activities. That's our capability. We can do web service, right? We need create token. We need to use the REST protocol, and that will create our role. So if I create this role and come down here, we can check this. If we clear the filter, we know what we've got. We've got practical grader grade, create token, which would be the same if we had used the restricted users flag and set it to true. We would then have to give the person or the users that capability, and then we obviously need the use to allow them to use the web service. Okay, so this is our practical grader role. So we need to assign some users to that role. I'll go back to site administration, users, and assign system roles. A little bit easier to go that way, because when you click on these other ones, you suddenly get a mismatch of all the different types of plugins that would be in that area. So go in there, let's find our teacher and add teacher to it. So our teacher now is assigned that role, and what would have to happen in practical terms is that all the teachers would then have to be assigned to that role to be able to, or all the teachers who do practical subjects or need to use a practical grader will need to be assigned to that role. So let's go back to our code and actually define our actual service. So if you remember, if we look at our services, we've defined a class name, external practical grader, in our component area, in our component namespace. So we will go ahead and create our folders. So new folders, classes, external, and then create our file in there. Oh. Right, so create a new PHP file, and it's going to be called practical grader PHP, and this is our file. So usual stuff at the top, our namespace, as expected. So local practical grader external, and because we've followed the auto loading rules, our file and our class are exactly the same name. That gives us a auto loaded class, and we are extending external API. Okay. Now there are three functions for every service or every function that you build into your service. Okay, there is your actual function that you want. So if we look back at our services PHP, we are calling that function save practical grader grade in our class. At the moment we are returning okay, so that's the way the work is done. But then you have to define two other functions, one which is this function which is with the underscore parameters function name. So practical grader underscore parameters, and the other one is practical grader underscore returns. So what we've got is this will define the parameters we are expecting, and we will define them so we can check that we're getting the right kind of parameters coming in. And then the practical grade returns is the value or the operation that's what's going to be returned from our service and that's defining that. So at the moment, right, it's an empty array. We're not expecting any parameters yet, and then we are going to return a param text as the result of the operation, and that return will be okay, which is coming from there. Hope that makes sense. So this is what we expect coming in, this is what we expect going out, and this is the place where all the work actually gets done. So let's look at some of these. You may have noticed these here. These are external classes that are defined in external lib PHP in the lib folder to help with parameters and return definitions. So namely, you have external value, which is just a simple scalar value, an external single structure, which is an associative array, external multiple structure. This will be something that's a mix of different kinds of variables. And then we have the final one, which we use in our parameters. This is the definitions for the parameters coming into our function. Okay, now I think it would be a good time for us to actually test our service so far and see how it performs. Now I'm going to use curl on the command line, because obviously using the UI, the user interface test web service function in Moodle is of no use to us at the moment. So let's have a look at that. Now, if you're on Windows, I understand you can actually install curl, or there's something similar on Windows that you can use, or you can use a web-based tool that will allow you to test web services. Okay, and what you're trying to pass through is the username, the password, and a parameter for service, which is our practical underscore grades, and we obviously send that request to our Moodle URL. And the first call is to login /token.php. That will return a token that we can then use for the second step, which is to use the token and actually call our service as we've defined it. So let's try that now. So on the command line, let's do our call. So there's my command there, and I'll call it, and I've got a token, and this is the token I need to use for my second call. So there you go, there's my token, and we're calling the REST format. We want JSON returned. We're calling the function local underscore practical grader underscore save from our web server. Let's have a look. So I've got OK return. So that means so far so good. Back in our code now, we need to think about how we take this forward. So what have we got to do? First of all, we will need to identify the student for whom the grade is being specified. So for the two systems, they will need some way of identifying the same user. Now, that might be a student ID that's come out of, let's say, a student information system, or it could be, some kind of, let's say, employee number, if you're doing that kind of stuff. And in our case, what we're going to do, we're just going to use the email address as the identifier for the student. The other thing we need to identify is the activity that the grade is being that the grade is for, and to do that, we are going to use a useful feature of Moodle where you can specify ID numbers for lots of different parts of Moodle. Use the ID number. Activities, courses, what have you, all have a specified ID number field. And its main purpose is really to marry information between different systems. So we'll go on to Moodle and we'll actually choose an activity to grade. And then the last parameter, obviously, is going to be the grade itself, which could come in all sorts of forms. It could be a letter, A, B, C. It could be a percentage, like 20%, or it could be simply just a number or something else. So we've got to be a little bit careful with the grade and how we specify it. But let's go into Moodle and identify an activity that we will want to grade and identify a user that we're going to grade. Okay. So back in Moodle, I'll log in as admin. I could log in as teacher, I suppose. And let's go and we'll choose one in our test site because we've got lots of enrollments there. Turn editing on and we'll choose the other assignment we didn't mess with the last time. We'll choose assignment 8. Let's call it something else. Let's call it practical activity. And then we'll just go down, and for modules, we've got common module settings, and that's where you'll find ID number. So let's just give this as some kind of ID 13. It could be a catalog number from your catalog if you're selling courses, etc. So this is something you define for yourself. Moodle itself doesn't quite use it in the core, except I think when we're talking in terms of courses, etc. But let's save that, and let's just choose one of these students along here. We'll save the password or the email address, and put it aside so we can grade that user a little later on. And let's go back to our code now and put in some more functionality. So back in our code, let's add some more functionality into our class. So this is our file now. We're still returning OK from our save practical grader function, but this time we have defined some parameters to come in. We have our activity ID number, our student email, and activity grade. At the moment, we're just returning OK. But then in our parameters function, we are now actually specifying these parameters that we expect to come through. So we've got activity number, which we expect to be a param of alpha num ext. Letters of the alphabet and numbers, okay, and extended characters. So that's our activity ID number. Our student email address, a param email, and our activity grade we're specifying as raw because we don't want to mess with that. That will be up to the activity as how it deals, or the grade book as to how it deals with that grade. Okay. And then we're still returning from our returns, we are still returning the same thing. The other thing about the grade is that we didn't actually check our settings when we were in Moodle for the grade for that particular activity. It's set to the default, which uses points, and therefore just a number will do. But you would normally be careful to ensure that whatever you expect coming through as a grade for that activity actually will be what is specified as in its settings. Okay, so now let's have a look at what we need to do in terms of testing what we've got so far again. So extending what we did the first time, we still have to log in. We still need to get a token. A token. The token does have a time to live, so it's possible that even the token we got last time is still valid. And then we use the token. And what's changing now? We've got our request for the JSON format. We've got the function name that we had used the last time. But additional to that, now we've got an activity ID number, a student email, and an activity grade that needs to be added to the parameters in the call. So let's see how that would work on the command line. So I'm going to assume that our token is still good, and I'll paste in my command. So what I've got there is my the functions we use, the parameters we used previously, and then added in our A320, a student email for one of the students in that course, and I'm setting an activity grade of 80. So let's see what happens. We've got an OK. So again, we're good. Our parameters are good. So let's go back to our code. Back in our code, let's add some bones now to our main function, our where all the work needs to be done. So here we go. Right, we're using the globals, DB and user. So the first thing you should do is validate your parameters that are coming through, and then you call self validate parameters, passing it the parameter call and the actual parameters that have come through to your function. Okay. Then we need to identify the activity. So basically we get a record. We look at the records. We get a record from the database. I don't think there's an API method of doing this. So we have to go directly to the database. So we get a record from course modules. That's where it would be saved. And we're looking at ID number with the parameter that's been passed through for our activity, and then we're only asking for the ID and ID number to be returned or to make part of the record, right? And if we get a result back, a true result, remember get record will return false if the record is not found. We then use a very useful call, which is get course and course module from the course module ID. We pass it the activity ID, and we'll get back both the course object and the course module item. And the module name is what will be the mod name field in our course module object. Okay, and then we do some checks. So we check if the plugin actually supports feature grade has grade. So it checked to see if the module itself actually supports grading. Okay, and then we get the context of the module. We check if the user has that grading capability. Now we're checking that the teacher that is logged in, that person will have the capabilities to access the service. But now we are ensuring that that teacher actually has the capability to actually grade pupils in that course. Okay, so we're checking for that capability, which is mod and the module name and grade. So this will be the name. Oh, I think we chose an assignment module, so that will be the name of the assignment module, and we'll check for a capability that allows the user to grade. So at this point now, we check if the user has the capability to grade. So we get the capability information. Okay, we then check if the person has the that capability in the context, in our module context, and if not, we are going to raise an error. If the activity doesn't have a grade capability defined, which would be unusual, but let's just go with it. We can then check another capability that a tutor would have. So somebody that would be able to, let's say, mark the course complete. If they had that, then the chances are they would be able to mark the person complete and grade the person. So that's the thinking behind that. You could be more strict and just assume that if there's no grade, you're not grading the user. Okay. And so we get the activity, an activity based on our module name, and we get the ID for this instance. And then we have to set an additional field, the CMID for the activity module. And then we try and identify the user and determine if they enrolled on the course. So we find such users in that course with that student's email address. If we have too many, we raise an error. Shouldn't ever happen, but sometimes it does. Some systems actually allow duplicate email addresses. And then we find our student, we take the first one off, and our student ID, we get our student ID from there. Okay. If we don't find the user, then we're going to throw an error again, an exception that user does not exist in this course. Right. So all modules grade item update functions will have loaded or been loaded previously. So what we're doing is calling the modules grade item update function to actually do the update of the function. We could have tried to mess around with the gradebook, but it makes more sense to do it via the module's own functionality. And then we set up our grades, our parameter for the grade. So we've got the student ID, the actual grade that's been pushed through, the user ID of the person who's modifying it, so that will be the tutor. Date submitted is empty. Date graded is the time that this is happening. Okay. And then we add the grades. Now there seems to be a problem. Some output from the grade book uses mtrace, and so to avoid us having to generate output that will break the whole system, the whole external service, we capture the output and then we call the function, which is our function that we defined up here. So in our case, this will be assignment grade item update, and we pass it the grades. Okay, and then if we get a result, so we will then get a result that will be a constant defined by the gradebook. So update failed, item is locked, or update multi. These will all be the response that goes back to the external service. So we're not raising exceptions here, we're just sending back information about what the problem is with the actual grade itself. And then we have some catches here of errors. And again, we return our OK. So now that we've done that, we need to add some language strings for all the errors, etc. And let's do that. And there's our language strings. Things like our no capabilities, so user with the username does not have that capability, etc. All our error messages that are going back, no grading activity, too many grades, etc., etc. So that's all our strings. Okay. So let's upgrade. Let's upgrade our version of our plugin version, and save that. And again, let's actually upgrade on the command line and then just use our previous call to actually see if we can send through a grade. So let's do that. So here we go. We're calling the admin command line upgrade script. Looking good. And there we go. It's taking its time. And now we've done that. So let's use the call that we used previously. I'm assuming the token is still valid, so let's do that. And I've had a return OK. So let's go look in Moodle and see if anything actually did happen. So let's log in as teacher this time, and we'll go to our course. Now there's various ways to get to the grade, none of them very pretty, but let's click on that, and let's use the grade one. If I remember, this is from our previous lesson. The use I used was 23, I think. So if I look down here, 21, 20, 23. Okay, and there's my grade, 80%. That's the grade. Other way of getting to the grade book would be leave page, right? You could click on there, view all submissions, and then you could actually choose to view the grade book. And obviously we look for our assignment, which was assignment, audio feedback, practical activity, and then we have our grade for our user. Yep. So this is so it's worked, and this is where we will leave our external service plugin, and let's go and look at other ways in which external services are integrated into Moodle. So there are other ways that Moodle integrates with other external services, and a few of these. The SCORM activity enables AICC HACP functionality, which was a way in which users could share activities across share activities outside of the LMS. We have learning tools interoperability. This is new, much newer functionality that's come into Moodle, closely aligned with SCORM. There's a link there for you to go and have a look at. LTI took a few years to get into Moodle. I remember messing about with it before it was actually integrated into the core. It's an interesting way that they've actually done the integration, but if you really wanted to, go and have a look at that. It's quite interesting. Then there are other things like the authentication plugins. We've been through those in a previous lesson. Which connect to external services like LDAP and Active Directory, the external database, Shibboleth and OAuth2, etc. So we haven't covered the exporter class, which is another kind of extension that works with external services to export consistent data. Those are the other ways that Moodle integrates with external services. So not really strictly connected to the exporter class, but there are ways in which you can download data from Moodle, which allows you to maybe integrate other systems or use data that's in Moodle to integrate into other systems. And since we have a bit of time in this course, in this lesson, what I'm going to do is let's go and develop a data format plugin. So what is a data format plugin? So let's go and have a look in one of our courses. Let's go to our test course. We've got quite a few participants there. When you're working with lists and data, you occasionally get the opportunity to actually download data. So the table data here can be downloaded as comma-separated values, Excel, HTML table, etc., as you can see on the screen there. Okay, you notice there isn't a tab-separated value download. So what we're going to do is actually develop a tab-separated value export document or data format for our tables. Okay, for our data. Right, okay, let's go ahead. I can show you that. Let's get that. And if I just open that, we can just open that. Okay, and there you go. We've got a list of users in that course. Okay, so I'll just close that, and we'll go and develop a tab separated one, just as a way to practice our new skills. Okay. So back in our code, let's close everything and start again. So we'll close all and close that. And then we'll go to our data format folder and in there we have several folders, the different ways, and we will create our new TSV folder, TSV, and we'll do the language folders at the same time. And then our first file is obviously going to be version PHP. So this is our version file, the usual stuff, and our component name, obviously. So let's create our language file. And this is our language file. For our data format, we are also required to define a couple of strings. Notice you don't need the plugin name string to be defined, but then you do need to have your data format and the short name defined as strings. With these two functions, with just these two files, we can actually install our plugin. So let's do that. I'll log in as admin. We'll install our data format plugin. And let's go see what happens when we try and use it without any of the functionality in it. So go site home, go to test, go to participants, and then we'll select all. Shouldn't have done that. I wanted to select all users. And let's come back to the bottom of our screen, and we are going to try and use our tab separated, and therefore we have an error. So let's go and fix the error, and let's try it again. So I'm not going to bother logging out here. We'll leave this way it is, and let's go and actually add some functionality to our code. So back in our code, if we look at CSV, we'll notice that there's a classes folder and there's a class called writer, and that's what we need to do with our TSV. So we'll create a new folder called classes, and in there we'll create a PHP file called writer. Okay, so this is our class now. So we've got the namespace, data format, TSV. We have the class named correctly for auto-loading, following the name of the file. We are extending database data format base from the core function from the core functionality. Okay, and then in there we need to define our MIME type and our extension as public properties. And then we do have some functions that I've commented out because I'm not using it, but it'll give you an example of give you the sense that you're sort of like working with spreadsheets. So spreadsheets have been sort of integrated into this writer's setup. So for example, you have a function to start output. Now that's normally where you would put your headers. You would define the output for your headers, and then you have close sheet in case you're working with sheets. So you have a function to close the sheet, and then you have a final function in case you have footers that you want to add before you close the output. Now we're not using any of these. We are just going to use the start sheet and the write record, and basically this works. The data is being sent to the browser as it's being collected, so there isn't any sense of buffering or whatever, storing it up and then sending a whole file. You actually send the data straight down the line. So here we're calling a function, which is a private function because I'm using it in both places. So we have the start of the sheet columns, and we have the write record, again calling that function. Okay, so we are now, this is our private function that's being called by those two public functions, and we are basically using the internal fput CSV function to convert our array to a tab separated tab separated record. So we have, or line. So we get the data in, we make sure that we are getting it as an array. We open a space in memory. We put our data, rewind, get the data back out. So we're basically cheating a little bit using. We're not going through the palaver of actually doing it ourselves. So that's basically what it does, and that's the functionality done for your writer. So let's save that. Let's go back to Moodle and see how it works. So back in Moodle, I'll just continue and then we'll do that again. So select all 100 users. We'll go in there, tab separated values. It now asks me, do I want to open it? And I say yes. And if I click on there, I've got tab separated. Yep. And there you go. I've got the data. So I'll close that, and we will now close off the lesson and review what we've learned in this lesson. So that's it for lesson 8. In this lesson, we developed 2 plugins. One was the external service plugin using web services. We looked at the web services API, we looked at external functions API, and we also developed a data format plugin.